And welcome back. As America's premier Muslim civil rights group, the Council on American-Islamic Relations has worked for more than 25 years to defend the Constitution. Now, their mission is to enhance understanding of Islam, protecting civil rights, promoting justice, and empowering American Muslims. CARE New York serves as CARE New York serves Muslim New Yorkers through legal advocacy, education, media relations, civic engagement, as well as grassroots mobilization. And joining us now to share a little bit more is the legal director of Council on American-Islamic Relations of the New York chapter, Ahmed M. Mohamed. And Ahmed, good to have you here on the Social Justice Forum.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very glad to be here.
And excuse me, I want to talk a little bit in depth when we talk about really where we are with Muslim Americans, because as we look, particularly here in New York City, we're seeing a rise in hate crimes, but just give us a sense of the temperature that you're sensing right now, particularly in New York City when it comes to Muslim Americans.
Yeah, so there has been a rise in hate crimes, a rise in bias incidents targeting not just the Muslim community, but other communities, including specifically the Asian American community. A lot of it stemmed through, COVID and the actions and words of, President Trump that really riled up, bigots around the country and really made vulnerable communities targets. And that has made our work here at CARE New York extremely difficult to combat. So we, you gave the introduction about our mission and the work that we do and how we do it. And it really breaks down to three types of, work that we like to kind of describe it as, DEA, right? We defend, we empower, and then we advocate for our community. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to hate crimes, we're doing all three all in once. They're not generally mutually exclusive of each other. So we're defending our community members when it comes to attacks, bias, discrimination. We're empowering our community by giving them resources and the information on how they themselves can take steps to protect themselves and to stand up for themselves and know what their rights are in particular situations. And then we advocate for our community. In hate crimes, it's making sure that law enforcement are treating hate crimes targeting the Muslim community seriously. They're labeling them as such, because what we see is not only are we seeing underreporting from our community, but when there are reports, we're seeing law enforcement officials really not taking those crimes as seriously as they do other protected groups, or they're mislabeling, right? Because the city does have an incentive, whether we like to admit it or not, to have as little, just like they do when it comes to crime. They want to report as little amount of crime as possible. And a city that has a high number of hate crimes tends to get less tourism and is seen as less safe. And so there is that incentive for the city to not label these as hate crimes in some instances. And so we want to make sure that our community is being treated fairly, and the crimes that are impacting our community are being investigated seriously.
Yeah, and when we talk about investigation, obviously we know that a lot of advocacy has gone on for investigations into a lot of these crimes. How hard is it for you to really get both law enforcement, government officials to be responsive to some of these acts that are sometimes blatant and sometimes not so blatant? Because we know that in order to prove a hate crime, sometimes that threshold can be kind of high.
Yeah, the threshold is high, but we have to recognize that, when there are indicators, law enforcement needs to investigate. Law enforcement needs to do their job, which is not to prosecute a crime. That's the district attorney's office, right? And that's not done until all the evidence and the investigation itself has run its course, right? If there is an indication of a hate crime or a situation is very strange that is indicative of a hate crime, especially when we're in an environment of a high, hate crime period, law enforcement needs to take those steps to investigate it, because we're not going to know if it's a hate crime ultimately unless an investigation is conducted. We have had difficulty getting those hate crimes started to begin with, right? I mean, there is a classic case that was reported on in Bronx, of a young woman who was attacked on a MTA bus. She was told there was no evidence. The case was closed without any real investigation. She went out and investigated her own crime, and it turned out it was a hate crime. She found video footage. Our office eventually got involved and, helped advocate for her and her family, and forced the NYPD to reopen those investigations. Now, sometimes when you have an investigation, especially in a hate crime, not only is it a crime targeting the individual, but it really impacts the whole community.
Right.
And what happens in those situations is it's a traumatizing event for that individual. And when the individual has to relive that event over and over again through advocacy, right? Because sometimes advocacy means living your story in public. They're retelling those stories. It becomes extremely difficult for that individual to continue that fight long term, especially when you have law enforcement that's, not really putting in, the effort that we think sometimes they should, right? Sometimes they put in that effort while the media is watching, and then the effort lags off afterwards, and all of a sudden a year goes by and the case is no longer there, right? And it's hard for that victim to continue re-upping that life lived experience.
So what do we do as a community when we talk about combating Islamophobia? It's huge. We know that it's out there. What can we do as regular residents, everyday people, in dealing with combating Islamophobia?
Yeah. Look, I think the number one way to combat Islamophobia is to meet your Muslim neighbors. There have been study after study from the Pew Research Center, from others, that show that individuals who say they know a Muslim tend to like Muslims a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And individuals who say they've never met a Muslim, now they think they've never met a Muslim, that's what they think. They tend to not think very, nice things about Muslims, right? And that leads to hatred of the unknown, right? Ignorance, is very dangerous sometimes. And I think if you meet Muslims, you'll know that a lot of times they're your doctors, they're your nurses. There's, I think, 10% of the New York City public school teachers are Muslim, right? They're teachers, they're taxi drivers, Uber drivers, folks getting you, your food. They're essential workers. A large number of essential workers are Muslim. And if you know that, you will have a positive relationship with Muslims, right? Because an individual. We tend to, have a very difficult time hating people that we actually know, right? And then of course it's education, right? What is Islam? What has happened is there is a huge Islamophobia network that's a multi-million-dollar industry designed to create disinformation and hatred of Muslims. And so we have to combat that with real Islam, which means is letting people know what Islam is, right? Not going out and necessarily converting people to Islam, but educating them, right? Just like how I know a lot about, the Bible and Christianity and Judaism, right? I happen to grow up, around those communities, so I know a lot. So if I see, disinformation about, Christianity, I will know it and will not accept it as truth. And so that's, I think, really important. And, Muslims are more and more involved in politics and civics, right? And civil life. And I think that's important because once we start seeing Muslims in Congress, Muslims in City Hall, Muslims in Albany, there's going to be a reflection of our values, and, Muslims in daily life will become, more normalized.
Right. And when it comes to policing, we know that there is that question that has been raised of communities of color about discriminatory policing when it comes to African Americans. Those are communities of color. And we have to also add the Muslim community into that. Talk to us about what you're seeing and what your goal is.
Yeah, so very important, nuance that a lot of people may not know, because a lot of times what the media has done is they have plastered Muslims with Arabs, right? Like Muslims are Arab, right? Or Arab, right? That's just not true. Not in this country, at least, right? So in this country, there is really no majority ethnic group that's Muslim. And so African Americans in this country, for a larger part, obviously African Americans brought here, as enslaved individuals. I think roughly 20% of the enslaved individuals were Muslim, right? So we've been here since the founding of this nation, and we, Muslims have built this country as well. And for the larger part, up until recently, African Americans made up the larger part of Muslims in this country, right? Think about, Malcolm X and the number of Muslims, especially here in Harlem, in New York City. he, brought into the Muslim faith. And so that's really important because right now, the African-American Muslim population is roughly 20%, according to studies, of the Muslim population in this country. And so why is that so important? Because when we talk about policing, right, you're African-American, you're already feeling every bit of the abuse and the systemic racism that comes from our policing system by being Black, right? And then you add on to that you're also Muslim, right? And so you're doubly affected. And of course, if you're a woman, you add to that as well. If you're a woman that wears hijab, you keep adding and adding and adding. And it's a lot of, a huge burden that you're feeling. So what we have seen is, law enforcement's directed at Muslims has largely seen Muslims as a national security threat, right? And that we are always tied when it comes to policing as, something to deal with terrorism, right? Our community members of all backgrounds, as long as they're Muslim, are going to get visits in a lot of cases from the FBI or from the NYPD. And a lot of times, even if it's simple outreach to our mosques, right, it's the Joint Terrorism Task Force, right? Imagine that the FBI is doing outreach to a synagogue or to a Catholic church or a Baptist church, right? They're going to send an outreach team normally. But when it comes to Muslims, they're sending an outreach team from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, right? And in essence, it's a way to surveil that community and to try to convince that that mosque leader, the imam, to become, an inside individual for the FBI. We saw huge surveillance from the NYPD during Bloomberg and Giuliani's administration towards the tail end that mapped Muslims all over New York City, including going more than 100 miles away from the city, right? Can you imagine we were using our taxpayer dollars to send NYPD officers, undercover informants, undercover agents to camping trips that students in college were taking out in, like the wilderness in Philadelphia, right? And that continues. Now surveillance has taken on a new age, which is a technology-based surveillance, right? You have facial recognition, you have, cameras everywhere. You have profiling of, Black activists who are in the BLM movement. You have profiling of Muslims. You have profiling of individuals fighting for Palestinian freedom, and surveillance in all of these situations, and that leads to a huge like traumatic feeling and relationship that we have. There's a lot of distrust in law enforcement between the Muslim community and law enforcement. And it's really up to law enforcement to own up to their mistakes. They have to hold themselves accountable. If they don't, we'll do it, right? That's what we're here for, as as we advocate and organize our community to make sure that we're holding law enforcement accountable, that we're reducing, the law enforcement budget and really re-diverting that to resources around the city where it's needed. We don't believe in, trying to lock up everybody, right? That doesn't make sense, right? We have to be proactive in the steps that we're taking.
And when we talk about being proactive, honestly, awareness and outreach are just some of those things that are being done in a proactive way. Are you finding now that as the message gets out, are you finding as information is becoming more and more disseminated when it comes to Islam, when it comes to Muslims, that the message is being better received now than ever before? Or do you find it to be even more challenging now?
I think it's both. I think
I was going to say, right. I forgot to throw that in there. Or both, right? Right.
Yeah. So absolutely. Look, I think that there's, look, we're continually making that push, right? Of educating not just our community, but educating others. And we're seeing improvements. We're seeing more Muslims run for office in this country than ever before, right? By huge numbers. In January, we'll probably have the first Muslim city council member. No, I'm sorry, not the first. It'll be the second, right? Because Mr. Miller is also a council member right now. There'll be the first Muslim woman, I should say, on city council, right? We have 3 individuals who are state elected officials, right? And so that's really important because that gives us as a community, voices in places that hold a lot of power, right? And we hope that those individuals also reflect the values that we have, not just as an organization, but as a community, right? And standing up for justice, and making sure that not just our community is protected, but all communities are protected, because we believe that our freedoms are tied in with other marginalized communities, right? We don't subscribe to the theory of a model minority, right? We think that a lot of these policies, a lot of these systemic issues that are impacting us are also impacting our brothers and sisters in the other marginalized communities, like the Asian American community, like the Black community, like the African community, and so forth and so on. It's challenging because the other side, right, the Islamophobia network, is very well funded, right? And that, this interview here probably will get spun as being some sort of, radical type of thing that I've said, right? Who knows, cutting a line that maybe I've said and reinterpreting it out of context, right?
Right.
That's what we see a lot in the Islamophobia network, is to demonize our individuals who may be leaders within their communities in the Muslim community. And it's a difficult challenge to work with. And what we are seeing is our world is becoming more polarized, right? There are a lot more extremes when we're talking about in politics now than ever before. And that's really, really difficult. What we also know is that we can't sit on the sidelines, right? And we hope no one is sitting on the sidelines. You have to choose. You're either on the side of equality, equity, and justice, or you're on the other side. And I think if you're sitting in the middle, you're really helping the side that's doing this country and our communities a great disservice.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to have to leave it there, but certainly a lot to talk about. Want to have you back, certainly, as we can continue to break down some things. But a great conversation, at least great enlightenment. And so for our viewers, there's nothing edited here. You get the full straight narrative, and you can get a chance to see the whole interview in its entirety, nothing edited here. And hopefully that you'll be able to find out more about the Muslim community and to really be able to combat Islamophobia, which is very prevalent in our society. Ahmed, thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, listen, thank you. And let's go take a quick break. We got more here on the Social Justice Forums. We'll continue our conversation, elevating the conversation as we continue right after this.